public. In fact, you went to work for him. He hired you.
Yeah.
Right. But here's from what I can tell, is the central question: imminent threat. Now, the president has said many times to many people, including the public, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he must have said that to you. You don't have to say it, but he said it to everybody. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. They can't have a nuke. Whenever asked, we say, let's just start here. They can't have a nuke. Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. Everyone agreed with that conceptually. Was Iran on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon?
No, they weren't, 3 weeks ago when this started, and they weren't in June either. I mean, the Iranians have had a religious ruling, a fatwa, against actually developing a nuclear weapon since 2004. That's been in place since 2004. That's available in the public sphere. But then also we had no intelligence to indicate that fatwa was being disobeyed or it was on the cusp of being lifted. The Iranian strategy, it's actually pretty pragmatic. The Iranians are obviously aware of what's taking place in their region. And their strategy was to not completely abandon their nuclear program, because they saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya when he said, hey, I've got no more nukes. I'll do what you say. I'll give up my nukes.
And we gave him the Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, we regime changed him, and he was executed by his own people in the most horrific way.
Oh, sodomized by a bayonet. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what
It's funny he's laughing at that. So Joe Kent published his resignation letter on X, and the next morning he was sitting in Tucker Carlson's studio. A 2-hour professionally produced sit-down interview doesn't really get arranged in 12 hours. That means before Joe Kent resigned, the Tucker interview was already booked. Then he appeared with Candace Owens at a Catholic convention. I smell a media rollout. But for whose benefit do you think?
That's the lesson, I think, that the entire region took from that when Hillary Clinton.
Unfortunately, that is what the neocon, neoliberal warmongers, that's the lesson that they showed everyone in the region. And then conversely, the Iranians also knew that if they came out and said, okay, we've got a nuke, whether they were bluffing or not, Saddam Hussein, Iraq right next door. So they kind of had this.
And he hung, I think.
He was hung by his own people, after a bloody, war that's still essentially going on inside of Iraq. So the Iranians' position, when viewed from the lens of the region, was actually fairly pragmatic. They were preventing, themselves from developing a bomb, but they still wanted the ability. They wanted the ability to enrich. They wanted the ability to have some components so that they weren't completely stripped of it. And when we always assessed that they were either several months or a year, 2 years away from actually being able to develop a nuclear weapon. And that's not because the Iranians are stupid people. I think we can tell right now that the Iranians are anything but stupid. They had the ability, I think, that the brain power to actually develop one, or they could have simply traded a ton of oil with Pakistan or with someone else to actually get a nuclear weapon. They were not doing that. We had no intelligence to indicate that they were.
Then why was the president, was he told that they were on the brink of it? Why at the beginning of every conversation about Iran would the president say, I don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon? Why was that the central question when, and you would know since you were the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, why would he say that if there was no intelligence or evidence that they were actually developing a nuke?
So a couple things. This is what I talk about in the letter about this ecosystem of information that's laundered through a lot of prominent neoconservative types that are very sympathetic to the Israeli cause, and then also Israeli government officials who give us things in semi-official channels. What they did was they created basically a shifting red line or a new red line. So if the president's red line was Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, we've actually got a lot of trade space in there for a deal to be made, because of what I just described with the Iranian policy. Essentially, the Iranians saying, okay, well, we don't want a nuclear weapon. Well, that means we basically are at a point where we can start negotiating and we can come up with a deal. And the president is a fantastic deal maker. So if your goal is to move us away from any kind of deal and your goal is to move us into a conflict, you have to shift that red line. And that's where a lot of this, I would say, what became a de facto U.S. policy of Iran can have no nuclear enrichment. It was laundered through a lot of the different talking heads, Mark Levin, Mark Dubowitz. You've got the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, you name it. Washington, D.C. has plenty of pro-Israeli lobbyists who will come and say those things, who will publish think pieces on it, who will go on the media, who will run op-eds in the Wall Street Journal to talk about this, why they can't have any enrichment whatsoever. And then we have a high degree of engagement with Israeli government officials who will come in and say, well, they're they're enriching and they could enrich or they could enrich more, and that will get them closer to a nuclear weapon. So then enrichment basically became the new U.S. policy. And the only official I've heard, and folks are welcome to look for this, that said this in the first Trump administration was Mike Pompeo. He said it. The president didn't say it. The president has been very consistent. He said they can't have a nuclear weapon. But again, like I said, that puts us at a place where we actually could have negotiations. And only President Trump, I think, could successfully have negotiations with Iran because he actually punched them in the face. And the Iranians had been walking all over us. They had been killing our soldiers. All of that is true. I have no sympathy whatsoever for the Iranians, what their proxies were doing. President Trump level set that when he killed Qasem Soleimani and he killed Abu Mahdi Mohandas. The folks who wanted to push an actual regime change war in Iran knew this, and they knew there was a potential to get a deal, or there was a potential for President Trump just to continue the policy of maximum pressure sanctions, and if you come after us, we will hit you hard. And that got the protesters out on the street in Iran, and that's actually what the regime feared the most. I don't think the Ayatollah feared dying, not because he, is some crazy lunatic. I'm sure some degree of the Shia martyrdom culture played a factor in that. However, I think he knew that if he was killed, the regime would survive because the people would rally around the regime.
I believe you predicted this, some years ago. I think we're watching. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what we're watching, but it seems consistent with what we are watching. So I'm just focused on this question of imminent threat because that's really the only justification I think most Americans would accept for a preemptive war.
Certainly.
Otherwise, just like a war of choice done because Bibi told you to, and no one wants to get behind that because it's obviously illegitimate. So imminent threat, you're saying that there was no intelligence that you saw with the highest level clearance, obviously involved in this conversation, that showed an imminent threat from Iran to the United States?
No, unless we took certain actions, unless we came after them in a way that they thought threatened the regime. Then we basically knew what they were going to do.
Well, okay,
but
right, of course.
Right, but like any country. So if you attack any country, we know that they're going to have a reaction.
We face an imminent threat once we attack you.
Fantastic. Yeah, exactly. But there was no intelligence that said, hey, on whatever day it was, March 1st, the Iranians are going to launch this big sneak attack. They're going to do some kind of a 9/11 Pearl Harbor, et cetera. They're going to attack one of our bases. There was none of that intelligence. Again, back to what we know about the Iranians, they're very, very deliberate with the escalation ladder. And again, they're only deliberate under President Trump's leadership because they knew and they took President Trump very, very seriously.
So, I mean, I just think it's a remarkable thing to nail down because you're not some guy on Twitter. You're a senior, as of yesterday, you were a senior U.S. Intelligence official who's not hostile to President Trump, who's not here to write a tell-all book or launch a media career. So I think you're a sober voice on this. And just to be clear, there was no intelligence that showed an imminent threat. There was no intelligence that showed they were on the cusp of building a nuclear weapon. There was no intelligence, indeed, that showed they were trying to build a nuclear weapon. And nobody said, I've seen it, but you haven't. It exists, but you just haven't seen it. Did you ever hear anybody say there is intel that shows this?
I did not, no. But I know how this works. I know the Israeli officials, some in intelligence, some in government.
So Joe Kent, who had the highest level of clearances, is saying there was no imminent threat from Iran. He's not leaking a document, he's not naming sources, but he is telling you that the classified picture was different from the public justification for a war. And that's a huge claim. And Tucker doesn't challenge this. This is either a heroic act of public service or it's a selectively honest account that reveals what's useful and withholds what isn't. Now, Joe Kent isn't telling you what the president or the vice president knew. He's basically telling you Donald Trump, the president of the United States, was tricked, almost taking his agency away. So what does that make him?
Government will come to U.S. government officials and they will say all kinds of things that we know from our intelligence just simply isn't true. And they'll say, hey, I'm giving you a preview. It's not in intelligence channels yet, but here's what's going to happen. And that doesn't usually come to
Wait a second. I mean, I thought that U.S. policymakers made their decisions on the basis of intelligence collected and or vetted by our intelligence. That's why we have intelligence agencies that soak up hundreds of billions a year. But you're saying that Israeli officials short-circuited the entire U.S. government and just went right to American policymakers and said, it doesn't matter what your country says, here's what we know? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, usually they're pretty slick, and they'll say, hey, this isn't in intelligence channels yet because it's going to take some time to get there. And here they're on the cusp of building a bomb. You know, they're going to, I don't know, you pick your topic. A lot of times they'll sample different things until they find what sticks. But in general, the narrative about, you know, they're going to do a preemptive attack, or really just they're going to build a nuclear weapon. And if we don't stop them now, they're going to build a nuclear weapon. And enrichment is the pathway to that. They're going to continue enriching at whatever percent. Enrichment became the narrative. And so that hung up and that short-circuited and really sabotaged the entire negotiations, because the Iranians basically said, like, we're not going to negotiate if the whole starting point is no enrichment. And again, that had nothing to do with a nuclear weapon, and the Iranians essentially agreed to that. So the Israelis came in, they moved that red line, and they would do a lot to say, like, oh, they're enriching, and you know what that means? That means in X amount of time they could have a nuclear bomb. You have to ask now. And then the way the ecosystem would work is that the talking heads on TV, you know, your Mark Levins, Sean Hannity's, et cetera, they would say basically the exact same thing that night on TV, or there would be a piece written in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, that would say something very, very similar. Yet, if you looked in classified intelligence, we didn't see any of that.
I mean, that must have been such a weird experience for you.
Bizarre.
Since you have access to the biggest and most powerful and presumably the best intel agencies in the world, and you're seeing people say things as fact when you know that they're not facts.
Right.
What was that like?
Infuriating. And I think that's why, in general, in the lead up to this last iteration, a good deal of key decision makers were not allowed to come express their opinion to the president.
Not allowed by whom?
I think
So Joe's infuriated. That's interesting. Joe Kent ran for Congress twice, in 2022 and 2024. In both campaigns, he attacked his Democratic opponents for not being pro-Israel enough. He said Trump did the right thing after October 7th, and Democrats didn't give Israel what it needed. He publicly disavowed people who criticized the Israel lobby, calling them anti-Semites. He said their views subtract from inclusive populism. Now, that was 2 years ago, and today his entire resignation letter is built around the argument that the Israel lobby dragged America into a war. So, what changed? Kent's position on targeted strikes versus regime change has been fairly consistent. What's changed is his position on the lobby. 2 years ago, criticizing the lobby made you an anti-Semite. Today, criticizing the lobby is the centerpiece of his resignation. Maybe he's had a genuine awakening. People change their minds all the time. What do you think?
I think it's important for me right now just to stay on the facts. I don't want to point names. I don't want this to become a name calling or this guy did this on this day.
But any leader has gatekeepers, and so you're saying that you were prevented from bringing this information directly to the president by gatekeepers.
Well, there wasn't a robust debate. So in general, because our assessment really hadn't changed, we would send those up through intelligence channels. Everybody's kind of reading the same intelligence, but then what actually gets briefed to the president can be very, very different depending on who and how it's delivered. And without a level set from the intelligence community, someone like D&I Gabbard coming in and saying, Mr. President, like, here's the full scope of the intelligence and what it means, you're kind of lacking that sanity check of where we're at, or at least a good sampling, to gauge how accurate what the Israelis are saying is. And that process, in my view, was largely stifled in this second iteration. There was robust debate and robust discussions leading up to the 12-day war into Midnight Hammer. But this second round, to me, and I'm sure others will refute this and disagree with me, but what was conducted by just a handful of small of advisors around the president.
That is true. I believe what you're saying is true.
Are you kidding me? Joe Kent just spent 10 minutes naming think tanks, naming Pompeo, naming media figures, describing the whole system. But when Tucker Carlson asks, who kept you out of the room? Now he doesn't want to name names. Come on, man. We all know why he won't say it. That person's either still in power or the name's so big that dropping it would cause an earthquake. Either way, it tells you everything. Do you believe this intelligence official? Who is the gatekeeper he won't name? Drop your guesses in the comments. Who is the gatekeeper? I'm telling you guys, the comment section is going to figure this out in 5 minutes.